The air in Silverwood University hummed with an almost sacred hush. Sunlight filtered through ancient stained glass windows, painted geometric patterns across the polished floors of the physics building, highlighting dust motes dancing in what felt like the very breath of genius. But this wasn't just another quiet morning in academia. Up in the cavernous lecture hall for advanced quantum mechanics, a different kind of tension was building, thick, palpable, and charged with anticipation. They waited for her to stumble, certain she didn't belong. Every creak of a seat, every rustle of a notebook felt amplified, a subtle judgment in a room where the laws of the universe were supposedly unbiased. But when Ilara solved a problem that even quantum physicists at MIT grappled with, the entire auditorium would fall silent. And for the first time, those who had once looked down on her were forced to confront their own blind spots. The cold, white lights of the lecture hall illuminated more than 100 students, all meticulously flipping through notebooks, clicking open laptops, preparing to face one of the most rigorous minds in the department, Dr. Vivian Thorne. Today wasn't a normal class. The front rows weren't just filled with eager students. A group of venerable professors from different departments sat right at the front, observing like judges at a trial. They weren't there to learn. They were there to evaluate. This was an open lecture where Dr. Thorne would demonstrate her unforgiving teaching methods to them. Her severity, she believed, was necessary. Weak minds had no place in the intricate universe of physics, and those not up to par would be eliminated from the very first round. In the middle rows, a young woman quietly lowered her head, her fingers spinning a pen. She didn't draw attention to herself, didn't talk to anyone. A worn gray sweater, simple jeans, and a notebook filled with neat, almost artistic handwriting. Her name was Ilara Vance. She didn't need to stand out. After all, the numbers and theories swirling in her mind spoke volumes for her. But for some, just the color of her skin, or the fact she was a woman in a field historically dominated by men, was enough to give them a reason to look down on her. In the front row, Dr. Marcus Sterling, a renowned astrophysicist and one of the most influential lecturers in the department, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His gaze swept over the students, then froze when he saw Ilara. He smirked, chuckling softly. "That young black woman in an advanced quantum mechanics class, I bet she won't last the whole session." The professors next to him nodded in agreement, as if it were an obvious truth. BH sciences aren't meant for them, probably got in here through some kind of diversity quota. Soft laughter echoed, no one bothering to hide it. They weren't talking about quantum mechanics. They were talking about Ilara. But Ilara remained silent. She was all too familiar with such comments. She'd walked into too many rooms where she knew she was being judged before she even spoke, where the whispers weren't about her ideas, but about her very presence. How many of us have felt that same sting, that feeling of being an invisible student in a world of self-proclaimed elites? It's like water off a duck's back, sure, but every drop still leaves a residue, a faint imprint of doubt that you have to actively brush away. They thought she would fail. They thought they were right. They had no idea that today would be the day they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The atmosphere in the lecture hall seemed to thicken as the sharp click of Dr. Vivian Thorne's high heels echoed on the cold tile floor. Her entrance brought an absolute wave of silence. No one dared speak. No one dared to be distracted. Her posture was ramrod straight, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the cold light. Her face showed nothing but absolute confidence, an authority that didn't need to be expressed with words. She didn't need to ask for respect, because the moment she walked in, she demanded it. Thorne scanned the room, not in a hurry. She wasn't just checking for focus. She was assessing who could keep up and who was simply wasting space in her classroom. Students' gazes immediately dropped, avoiding her sharp eyes, as if they feared that even a moment's distraction would make them the target. Then, her gaze stopped on Ilara. It wasn't long, but it was enough to show what she was thinking. That look wasn't just observation. It was a silent message, a question unspoken, but clear enough that no one could miss it. Do you think you belong here? In an instant, Thorn narrowed her eyes, then moved them away, as if Ilara's existence wasn't worth her attention. No one noticed, but Ilara did. He turned, took a piece of chalk and wrote on the board with sharp, precise strokes. Last week, we studied multidimensional matrices. Today, we move on to perturbation theory in quantum field dynamics. Immediately, complex equations appeared, one after the other, neat and precise. Students scrambled to take notes, trying not to fall behind. Some were confused from the very first line, but no one dared speak up. In Thorn's class, getting lost was your fault, not hers. In the front row, some guest professors nodded quietly, satisfied with Thorn's teaching style. They admired her not only for her brilliance, but for her harshness as well. They believed a great teacher wasn't one who helped students grow, but one who eliminated those who didn't deserve to be there. In the middle row, Ilara didn't rush to write notes. She observed, her eyes moving over the board calmly, coldly. While others struggled to keep up with Thorn's pace, she simply looked, as if those mathematical symbols were mere pieces in a puzzle she had known for a long time. But then she frowned, a small mistake. Not clear enough for everyone to see, but for Ilara, it was a serious error, a misapplied constant in a particularly tricky perturbation calculation. It wouldn't have an immediate effect, but if continued, the final result would be completely wrong. She hesitated. She knew that if she spoke up, she would become the center of attention. Thorn wasn't the type to like being corrected, especially not in front of students and other professors. She wasn't the kind of person who took challenges lightly. And moreover, Ilara wasn't stupid enough to think Thorn was the only one in the room with prejudices. A whole row of guest professors were sitting there. Many of them had looked at her with disdain the moment she entered. She spoke up. She wouldn't just be confronting Thorn, she'd be confronting the whole system. She could ignore it, let it slide, continue with the lecture like everyone else, but that thought made her stomach churn. Ilara hated arrogance. Hated people who believed they could never be wrong, hated those who looked down on others just because they didn't look like them. This was a calculated risk, a decision made in a few seconds. She took a slow breath, raised her hand, and broke the silence of the room. "Professor, there's a mistake in the perturbation calculation." The space seemed to freeze. Thorn stopped writing. The whole class went completely silent. A multitude of eyes turned to Ilara. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the silence of the students. It was Thorn's faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had found its prey, daring to challenge it. Each second stretched on endlessly. Thorn didn't need to shout, didn't need to show anger. She simply looked at Ilara, evaluating her like a complex physics problem whose solution she already knew. Then she smiled lightly. "A mistake, you say?" She turned back, scanned the board, as if just for show, then turned back to Ilara. "Are you sure?" Her voice was soft, but beneath it was a trap laced with danger. Some of the guest professors smirked in disdain. A few students started whispering. A professor, beside Sterling, leaned in and whispered into his ear, "I told you, she's just dug her own grave." Sterling chuckled softly, folded his arms, and waited for the perfect destruction he was about to witness. Ilara stared straight into Thorn's eyes, unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure." Thorn stopped smiling, and for a split second, Ilara saw her expression change. No longer a smug person, but someone who was considering whether she might have just made a mistake. The lecture seemed to freeze in that moment. The rustling of pages, the hurried typing on keyboards, all went silent. Only one thing remained, the razor-sharp gaze of Thorn. Her eyes pierced through the student who had just spoken up. neither angry nor raised in volume, but enough to make every cell in the opposing person's body shrink in fear. "Do you think, or do you know?" The question echoed in the stillness, steady like a blade gliding across the surface of glass. There was no explosion of anger, only a chilling coldness, an unspoken reminder that in this room, only one person was allowed to speak the truth. The student Thorn had just addressed froze, gripping her pen as if it were her only lifeline. I just thought that—" "If you are not sure, don't waste my time." The invisible strike had fallen. Her face turned crimson. She lowered her head quickly, retreating as if she wished to disappear. No one spoke. No one wanted to be the next target. Elara closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. She had witnessed too many scenes like this before. Professors who placed themselves on a pedestal, treating students as those without the right to question, like children needing to be taught through fear. She hated that kind of professor. And so, she raised her hand. The whispers dwindled, then disappeared entirely. A slight arching of Thorn's brow passed across her face. She wasn't surprised, but she didn't seem pleased either. It was a neutral expression, as if this were a game whose outcome she already knew. Yes, Elara was resolute. Unlike the girl earlier, she didn't hesitate. "Actually, there's a mistake in the perturbation step. The coefficient was introduced too early." At that moment, the atmosphere had completely shifted. It was no longer the hesitation of students before Thorn, but anticipation, an eager wait for someone to be crushed. And the guest professors were the most excited. Sterling chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. It was a venomous amusement. "This kid thinks she's smarter than Thorn." Another professor smiled, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with an anticipation as if ready to enjoy a thrilling spectacle. Thorn didn't respond immediately. She remained standing still, staring at Elara, her gaze unwavering. The silence stretched intentionally, as if she were allowing her to sink into her own foolishness. Then she smiled. It was not a kind smile, nor a friendly one. It was a smile full of arrogance. "Are you sure?" The question again, and this time it was not just a question, it was a warning. Elara did not flinch. "Yes, I'm sure." A brief flicker crossed Thorn's face, but quickly she regained her usual haughty expression. She slowly turned back, her eyes lifting to the board once again. The silence stretched. Elara didn't need to look at the board, because she knew she was right. But she wasn't the only one who saw the truth. Some students began whispering, a few leaning forward, trying to double-check the equation on the board. And then one of the guest professors began to pay attention. She was looking for the mistake, and Elara knew that because the mistake was there. Thorn scanned each line of the board with extreme care, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a reason to refute her. The truth could not be denied, but if she admitted it, she would lose the most valuable thing, her absolute authority. Elara had put her in a position where she couldn't control the situation. Thorn clenched the piece of chalk tightly in her hand. The lecture hall seemed to freeze again. Then she turned back, looking at Elara with a smile no longer carrying her previous arrogance. "Good. If you're so confident." She extended her hand, passing the chalk to Elara. "Go to the board and fix it." At that moment, the whispers in the class turned into quiet laughter. Some students exchanged knowing glances as if they understood what was about to unfold. But the most important thing wasn't how the students reacted. It was how the guest professors reacted. Sterling leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his lips curling into a faint smile. "This just got interesting." Another professor nodded, a tone of excitement in his voice. She just backed herself into a corner. They knew Thorn well. They knew this was not just a simple request, it was a trap. Elara stood up calmly. She didn't say a word, showing no emotion on her face. But as she walked to the board, as she took the chalk from Thorne's hand, she knew she couldn't back down, because from this moment on, this was no longer a class. This was a battle. A brief moment passed as Alara held the chalk in her hand, but in Thorne's eyes, it was a battlefield she had already set up. She knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to threaten. A good trap isn't one that scares the prey right from the start. It's one that makes the prey step in with confidence. The moment Alara stepped up to the board, she heard a soft chuckle from the front row. A guest professor, Dr. Sterling, leaned slightly toward the colleague sitting next to him, his voice low enough for no one else to hear, but clear enough to be an insulting whisper. "Look at her, she actually thinks she can do this. Let's see when she falls apart." Thorne stood there, arms crossed in front of her chest, in no rush. In her mind, the outcome of this little drama had already been decided. She had seen students like Alara before, self-satisfied, arrogant, thinking that just because they solved a problem, they could put themselves on the same level as the great minds. But she had never lost a battle. She had never let a student, especially one like Alara, take away her absolute power in this classroom. Alara didn't care about the whispers behind her. She simply erased the mistake, replacing it with a more accurate perturbation calculation. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Each stroke of the chalk on the board was firm, no trembling, no errors. The classroom grew eerily silent. No more whispers like before. The students who had been mocking her were now leaning forward, staring at the board, trying to figure out what Alara was doing. One student blinked a few times, looked at his notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did she actually fix it? No one could deny it. Thorne stared at the board, her arms crossed tighter. She couldn't refute it. The thing is, Thorne rarely made mistakes, and if she did, no one was brave enough to point them out in front of her. But now, her mistake was right in front of everyone. She could ignore it. She could try to twist the situation. But once the problem was fixed correctly, she couldn't deny the truth. And Thorne hated that truth. She pursed her lips and then nodded curtly, as if this meant nothing. Good. But Alara didn't miss the brief tension in her expression, the slight tightening of her hand, and especially the fleeting glance between her and Sterling, an unspoken look that said, the battle wasn't over yet. And then Thorne played her next card. She turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. Faster, more complex. Mathematical symbols overlapping like a maze with no exit. Some students looked at each other, confused, trying to follow the steps, but the more they looked, the more tangled it seemed. When she finished, she turned back to face Alara, the chalk in her hand like a sword ready to strike. But if you're really that good, she placed the chalk in the tray, the clink of it cutting through the silence. Do you dare to try a harder problem? The lecture hall erupted in excited whispers. Thorne wasn't just challenging Alara. She was challenging her in front of the entire faculty. She didn't just want to defeat her, she wanted to utterly destroy her self-esteem. A guest professor chuckled lightly, his voice filled with excitement. So the real fun is just beginning. Sterling smiled knowingly. I bet she'll stumble at the first step. Alara looked at the problem on the board. A problem not meant for first-year undergraduates. A problem that even graduate students might spend hours trying to solve. Alara took a slow breath, not because she was scared, but because she knew exactly what was happening. Thorne wanted to push her to the edge, make her bow her head, admit she had gone too far. But what Thorne didn't know was, Alara lived for moments like this. Alara slowly placed her hand on the chalk. The room fell silent again. She was calm, showing no sign of fear. She had accepted the challenge. And if Thorne thought she would crumble, she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Alara stood before the board, chalk in hand. The quiet laughter of the other students, their knowing glances, the barely suppressed snickers from the front row, It all hung heavy in the air. Dr. Sterling had just confirmed their collective belief. She just backed herself into a corner. They saw this as a simple request, but Alara and Dr. Thorne knew it was a trap. A good trap, after all, isn't one that scares the prey right from the start. It's one that makes the prey step in with confidence. A brief moment passed. Alara's hand, steady and deliberate, moved to the board. She didn't say a word, showing no emotion on her face. But as she took the chalk from Thorne's hand, she knew she couldn't back down. Because from this moment on, this was no longer a class. This was a battle. Dr. Sterling leaned slightly toward a colleague, his voice a low, insulting whisper. "Look at her. She actually thinks she can do this. Let's see when she falls apart." Dr. Thorne stood there, arms crossed in no rush. In her mind, the outcome of this little drama had already been decided. She had seen students like Alara before, self-satisfied, arrogant, thinking that just because they solved a problem they could put themselves on the same level as the great minds. But Thorne had never lost a battle. She had never let a student, especially one like Alara, take away her absolute power in this classroom. Alara didn't care about the whispers behind her. She simply erased the mistake, replacing it with a more accurate perturbation calculation. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Each stroke of the chalk on the board was firm, no trembling, no errors. The classroom grew eerily silent. No more whispers like before. The students who had been mocking her were now leaning forward, staring at the board, trying to figure out what Alara was doing. One student blinked a few times, looked at his notebook, then back at the board. Wait, did she actually fix it? No one could deny it. Dr. Thorne stared at the board, her arms crossed tighter. She couldn't refute it. The thing is, Thorne rarely made mistakes, and if she did, no one was brave enough to point them out in front of her. But now, her mistake was right in front of everyone. She could ignore it, she could try to twist the situation, but once the problem was fixed correctly, she couldn't deny the truth. And Thorne hated that truth. She pursed her lips and then nodded curtly, as if this meant nothing. Good. But Alara didn't miss the brief tension in her expression, the slight tightening of her hand, and especially the fleeting glance between her and Sterling. An unspoken look that said, the battle wasn't over yet. And then Thorne played her next card. She turned away, took the chalk, and began writing a new problem on the board. Faster, more complex. Mathematical symbols overlapping like a maze with no exit. Some students looked at each other, confused, trying to follow the steps. But the more they looked, the more tangled it seemed. When she finished, she turned back to face Alara, the chalk in her hand like a sword ready to strike. But if you're really that good... She placed the chalk in the tray, the clink of it cutting through the silence. Do you dare to try a harder problem? The lecture hall erupted in excited whispers. Thorne wasn't just challenging Alara, she was challenging her in front of the entire faculty. She didn't just want to defeat her, she wanted to utterly destroy her self-esteem. A guest professor chuckled lightly, his voice filled with excitement. So, the real fun is just beginning. Sterling smiled knowingly. I bet she'll stumble at the first step. Alara looked at the problem on the board. A problem not meant for first-year undergraduates, a problem that even graduate students might spend hours trying to solve. Alara took a slow breath, not because she was scared, but because she knew exactly what was happening. Thorne wanted to push her to the edge, make her bow her head, admit she had gone too far. But what Thorne didn't know was, Alara lived for moments like this. Alara slowly placed her hand on the chalk. The room fell silent again. She was calm, showing no sign of fear. She had accepted the challenge, and if Thorne thought she would crumble, she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The chalk slid across the board like a knife cutting through the air. Thorne had written each line deliberately, the mathematical symbols curving and overlapping as though they were not only written to challenge Alara, but also to intimidate her. This problem was not just a challenge, it was a declaration of war. The equation stretched twice as long as the previous one, with higher-order functions, nested integrals, and a system of nonlinear transformations that even the brightest students would have to chew on for hours. Thorn didn't just want to beat Alara, she wanted to crush her in front of everyone. She wanted to turn her into an example, a reminder to every student in the class that no one could challenge her without paying the price. A visiting professor sneered, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the table with clear delight. "She'll be stuck soon enough." A few students gasped. Some others fell silent, unsure whether to feel fearful or excited about what was about to unfold. Thorn set the chalk down, stepped back, and turned to face Alara. She waited. The whole class waited. But Alara didn't flinch. She stared at the problem for a few seconds. Not too long, not too short, just enough to understand its structure. Then she began to write without a hint of hesitation, not a single second spent pondering. The chalk in Alara's hand moved smoothly and precisely, as if her mind had already seen the answer and was simply transcribing it in the exact order she had mapped out in her head. The numbers and symbols appeared organized, the transformations performed with elegance, no unnecessary steps, no hesitations. Like a pianist gliding over the keys, each stroke of her chalk was part of a perfect mathematical symphony. The murmurs in the class began to fade. At first, some students whispered, thinking Alara was merely trying to appear confident. But then they looked back at the board and realized everything was correct. No mistakes, no stumbles. Alara didn't hesitate, didn't revise anything. She was solving the problem at an unbelievable pace. In the front row, Sterling had stopped laughing. Thorn maintained her posture, but her fingers tightened slightly, not out of fear, but confusion. Where had she gone wrong? She was certain this problem was tough enough to trap any student, at least for a moment. But Alara didn't just solve it, she did so with absolute confidence. Thorn glanced around the room, trying to find someone who felt the same as she did, someone who was also realizing that the tide had turned. And she realized everyone else was realizing it. Alara wasn't just solving the problem, she was taking back control of the room. Alara finished the last line. She set the chalk down, took a step back, and then turned to face Thorn. The silence in the classroom became suffocating. Everyone looked at the board, then at Thorn, then back at the board, as though they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. One student whispered quietly, "What the hell just happened?" A visiting professor adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on the board, desperately searching for any error, no matter how small. But there was nothing wrong. The problem had been solved flawlessly. Thorn stood frozen. An invisible tension hung around her, as if a rope was slowly tightening around her neck. She needed a mistake. She needed something she could use to dismiss Alara, to regain control, to prove she was still the one in charge of the classroom. But she found nothing, because there was no mistake. At the back of the room, a student let out a low whistle, a sound that broke the tense silence. Some other students began to whisper, but this time it wasn't mocking or skeptical. It was admiration. Something Thorn had never expected to hear in this classroom. Admiration for a student she had purposely underestimated. Sterling no longer looked amused. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowed. The earlier mocking confidence had completely vanished. Now, in his eyes, there was only one thing left, a discomfort mixed with a fear he didn't want to admit. "It can't be. There's no way she's this good." Thorn finally spoke, but her voice was no longer as firm as before. "Well, not bad." A cold, dry remark without a hint of emotion, but everyone could hear the awkwardness in it. Thorne didn't want to admit the truth, but even she couldn't deny what the whole room had witnessed. Elara Vance had passed the test. Not just passed, she had done so perfectly, to the point where no one could argue. Elara didn't need to smile. She didn't need to be arrogant or provocative. She simply walked back to her seat as every eye remained fixed on her, filled with astonishment. Thorne clenched her fist. She knew she couldn't let this end like this. If Elara had passed this test, she would throw another one her way, a challenge she couldn't possibly overcome. And so she picked up the chalk again. Well then, let's see what you can do with the next problem. This battle, it had only just begun. The silence in the classroom stretched like an unresolved, tense musical note. The gazes still lingered on the blackboard, where Elara had just solved the equation flawlessly, without a single mistake. In the front row, Sterling could no longer maintain the calm composure he had at the beginning. He raised an eyebrow, one hand on the desk, his fingers tapping lightly in rhythm with his suppressed frustration. "It's impossible! Surely she must have studied this problem beforehand." His words were not only directed at the other professors, but also served as a self-reassurance. Sterling could not accept that an unknown black student could solve such a complex problem more smoothly than graduate students. The professor next to him nodded in agreement, but was still stunned. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew they had misjudged Elara Vance. But Thorne wasn't going to let confusion take over. She wouldn't allow herself to lose without saying a word. Thorne walked to the lectern and pulled out a thick advanced physics textbook, a hefty book filled with problems that even graduate students struggled to understand. She was no longer trying to corner Elara with ordinary equations. She was going to raise the stakes to an entirely new level, a doctoral-level problem. She opened the book, flipped to a page near the end, then turned it towards Elara and the entire class. "Solve it." The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. Whispers erupted like crashing waves. Students lifted their heads, some leaning forward trying to see what challenge Thorne had just thrown out. One student inhaled anxiously. This is it for her. Another whispered in disbelief, "Is she serious? This is a level for doctoral candidates, not a first year?" A visiting professor chuckled, but his tone was no longer mocking. Instead, filled with genuine curiosity. "Now we'll see if this kid really has talent or if she's just lucky." Thorne didn't blink, her gaze still cold and sharp as a knife. She believed Elara would stumble this time. She believed no student, no matter how smart, could surpass their own limits when pushed too far. She waited for her to hesitate, for her to panic, for her to falter. But what she didn't expect was that Elara merely smirked. Not a hint of fear, not a shred of tension. She stood up, walking slowly yet confidently to the board, as if she had known this would happen. Some students held their breath, while others let out a small laugh, unsure whether it was out of nervousness or disbelief. But when Elara picked up the chalk, everything changed. No hesitation, no awkwardness. As everyone had anticipated, she immediately began solving the problem, as though she had done this hundreds of times before. Thorne narrowed her eyes. She didn't like this. She wanted to see Elara flounder, wanted to see her stop to think, wanted to see her bite her lip or furrow her brow like the other students when faced with problems beyond their ability. But Elara showed no sign of fear. Instead, her hand moved faster than with the previous problem, as though she had just found a problem truly worthy of her. Mathematical symbols appeared on the board with a terrifying clarity. Every transformation was accurate with no unnecessary steps. The students watching the problem began to understand that she wasn't just solving it, she was refining it, making it easier to understand, shortening the process that others might take hours to work through step by step. Some students started glancing at each other, their faces incredulous. A visiting professor tilted his head slightly, his gaze showing a trace of admiration. "Impossible." Sterling instinctively clenched his fist. his face shifting from frustration to genuine concern. "What the hell is this?" Ilara kept writing, as if unaware that the entire room was watching every stroke of her chalk. But she was fully aware. She knew exactly how Thorne and Sterling were feeling in that moment, and she relished it. 1 minute, then 2. Thorne clenched her hand, her eyes now showing a cold gleam that was no longer smugness, but real worry. Because she had made a mistake. She hadn't just challenged Ilara. She had given her the chance to showcase herself in front of the entire class. And now, everyone was witnessing something undeniable. Ilara wasn't just good. She was frighteningly brilliant. Ilara set the chalk down. She took a step back, crossed her arms, her gaze calm, yet sharp. The problem had been solved, and no one in the room could deny it. A visiting professor let out a soft breath, looking at the board again as if to check if he was dreaming. Thorne was silent. Sterling was silent. All the professors were silent. There were no excuses left. No one could say it was just a lucky coincidence. Ilara had won, right on their own turf. And for the first time in Thorne's teaching career, she didn't know what to say next. The sound of chalk hitting the tray echoed clearly in the silent space, a small sound, but it marked an irreversible moment. Ilara stood before the board, arms crossed, her gaze calm, yet sharp. The complex, doctoral-level problem, designed to break even the most brilliant minds, was solved. Perfectly. Dr. Thorne stood motionless, her mouth slightly agape. She had been so certain Ilara would falter, stumble, or at least show a flicker of doubt. Instead, Ilara had delivered a solution with breathtaking elegance, a method so streamlined it redefined how the problem could even be approached. Thorne searched the board, desperate for a flaw, a tiny miscalculation, anything to claw back control. But it wasn't there. Not only was it correct, but it was correct in a way no one else had seen. Across the room, the MIT PhD, Ilara's last remaining contender, suddenly stopped writing. His eyes widened, his head snapping up as he realized Ilara had finished. Finished before he'd even reached his final step. A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. Dr. Sterling, who minutes ago had worn a smug sneer, now sat utterly still, his face devoid of any expression. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. He couldn't reconcile what he believed about proper academic lineage with the undeniable genius unfolding before his eyes. He wanted to shout, to object, but the truth on the blackboard was too loud. Then, a voice, gentle yet thunderous, shattered the suffocating silence. It was one of the senior judges, a distinguished professor from a rival university. He slowly stood, his gaze sweeping over the astonished faces in the room, before landing squarely on Ilara. "We have a winner!" The auditorium erupted. It was a cacophony of sound, cheers from some students, gasps of disbelief from others, a stunned silence from those who still couldn't process what had just happened. Applause thundered like a storm, a chaotic symphony of recognition for the quiet prodigy who had defied every expectation. Ilara didn't jump up. She didn't pump her fist or shout in victory. She simply turned her head, her gaze meeting Dr. Thorne's across the tumultuous room. It was the same cold, unwavering stare she had given Thorne the first time she was challenged, months ago, when all this began. Ilara didn't need Thorne's acknowledgement. Not now. But Thorne had no choice but to realize, for herself, that Ilara deserved more than everything she had ever thought possible. Thorne could only stare. In that moment, amidst the booming applause and the joyous chaos, she knew she had lost. Not just this competition, not just this battle of intellect, but the entire perspective she had stubbornly clung to for so long. She had believed Ilara would never overcome this challenge, that her background would always be an invisible barrier. But she had been wrong from the very first moment. A judge from the central table, holding the pre-prepared solution sheet, stood up. What stunned everyone wasn't just that Alara got it right, but that her solution took an entirely different path, more streamlined, more efficient, with no unnecessary calculations. Whispers, first from the students, then gradually from the professors and mathematicians, spread across the room. Nobody spoke loudly, but their eyes clearly showed their immense surprise. The judge's voice, clear and formal, cut through the fading applause. He raised his hand, commanding a final silence. The winner of this year's National Math Contest is... He paused, letting the tension linger, ensuring no one would miss this moment. Alara Vance. The name echoed, sealing the victory. Thorne stood motionless, her face expressionless, her usual sharp eyes now holding an unusually vacant look. She had been ready to see Alara fail. She had been ready to prove that Alara couldn't win this competition, but now she was the one who had to face her own undeniable defeat. Alara had not only won, she had won in a way that left everyone speechless. Dr. Sterling sat motionless, his hand still clenched on the armrest. He couldn't speak a word. He had always believed that people like Alara could never reach this level. He believed that to stand at the top of the academic world, one needed pedigree, privilege, and the invisible power granted only to a select few from birth. But now, everything he believed in was shattered before his eyes. Alara didn't need a prestigious name. She didn't need anyone to sponsor her. She didn't need to come from the right institution. She only needed herself, and herself was more than enough. Sterling gritted his teeth, but he couldn't find any words to dismiss this result. The truth had spoken for itself. Alara remained seated, calm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She didn't need to stand up, didn't need to show off or be arrogant. The numbers on the board, the completed equations, the chalk marks full of certainty, these were her voice. These were her undeniable proof. The quiet aftermath of Alara's seismic victory reverberated far beyond the competition hall. The thunderous applause had died down. The shock of the MIT PhD's defeat had settled, and Dr. Thorne and Dr. Sterling had retreated, their silence louder than any shouts. Yet, the story didn't end there. In fact, for Alara Vance, it was just the beginning of a profound shift, not just in her own life, but in the very fabric of Silverwood University. The next morning, the atmosphere in Thorne's Advanced Quantum Mechanics Lecture Hall was unlike any other day. A palpable change hung in the air, a subtle electricity that everyone felt, but no one spoke aloud. The usual tension of students hunched over, frantically taking notes, was replaced by a restless anticipation. Glances were exchanged. Soft whispers filled the room as the door opened, and Dr. Thorne walked in. She maintained her usual demeanor, cold, calm, her face betraying no emotion. She placed her materials on the desk, adjusted her silver-rimmed glasses, and scanned the room. But this time, her gaze lingered on Alara just a little longer. Alara sat in the middle row, as always, still wearing her simple sweater, her eyes still calm, as if the earth-shattering events of the day before meant nothing to her, but the entire class knew. She was no longer the nameless student. She was the National Math Competition champion, the one who had beaten the brightest minds from the most prestigious universities in the country, the one who had made Thorne fall silent in front of top professors. Thorne didn't speak immediately. She flipped through a few pages of the textbook, a practice motion that usually projected absolute authority, but everyone in the room knew she could no longer pretend like nothing had happened. She paused. Then, not looking at anyone in particular, she spoke. Before we begin today's lecture, I want to say one thing. The class went completely silent. She paused for a second more, as if carefully choosing words she had never expected to utter. Then, her voice soft yet firm, she continued. Alara Vance has proven that talent has no gender, no background, no skin color. A simple statement, no embellishments, no exaggerations. Yet, those words landed with the weight of 1,000 lectures. The class was stunned. No one dared to utter a word. It was incomprehensible. These words, coming from Dr. Thorne, the embodiment of harshness, the gatekeeper who believed only the truly exceptional deserved a place in her world, the one everyone thought would never admit a mistake. But today she stood in front of the class and acknowledged the undeniable truth. Elara Vance was not just talented. She had shattered all the invisible barriers that people like Thorne, Dr. Sterling, and countless others had deliberately set up to block her. She had irrevocably changed the way they viewed fairness, real ability, and the very limits of the prejudices they once believed in. And in that moment, Thorne knew she could no longer deny it. Some students turned to look at Elara, eager for her response, but she only nodded lightly, without arrogance, without mockery. She didn't need Thorne's praise, didn't need her apology, because the entire world had already seen the truth. Thorne could no longer turn away and pretend that Elara hadn't fundamentally disproven her lifelong beliefs. And for Elara, that was more than enough. Thorne turned away, picked up the chalk, and began writing the new lesson on the board. No more long speeches, no excuses or explanations. She simply continued her work. But everyone in the class understood that today's lesson was profoundly different. Dr. Thorne was no longer the unbeatable professor, and Elara Vance was no longer the invisible student. In that classroom, everything had changed forever. Elara's reaction remained minimal. She didn't need fanfare or belated validation. She'd understood long ago that in a world often blinded by bias, genuine recognition wasn't freely given, especially by those who once doubted or actively blocked her. But that didn't matter. She'd always let her work speak for itself. She didn't engage in arguments, didn't feel the need to justify her worth, and never entered into endless debates about fairness or prejudice. She simply did what she did best. She let mathematics speak the truth that no one could deny. The equations, the numbers, the intricate mathematical symbols she had written on the competition board didn't need anyone to defend them. They transcended skin color, limits, barriers, and prejudice. They were either right or wrong. And in the world of mathematics, Elara was always right. Her victory wasn't just in winning a competition. It was a triumph in a much larger battle. The battle against the skeptical looks, the mocking laughs, the unspoken rules designed to determine her fate from the moment she first stepped into that classroom. No one could strip her of this victory. No one could change the undeniable fact that the student they had once looked down upon now stood at the pinnacle of academic achievement. Thorne continued the lecture as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, yet no one could deny the subtle but profound shift that had permeated the classroom. The condescending glances towards Elara had vanished. The mocking smiles behind her back were gone. Instead, there were curious gazes, quiet nods of respect, and whispered words of admiration. In the eyes of many students, a new awareness dawned, as if they had just witnessed an old, unjust rule being shattered before their very eyes. Elara hadn't just won for herself. Her victory resonated far beyond her personal achievement. She had won so that those who came after her wouldn't have to start from a lower position, simply because they didn't belong to a system built to hold them back. She had changed the collective perception of ability, intelligence, and sheer willpower. She had forced those who once believed she would never succeed to fall silent. And that, in itself, was more valuable than any fleeting praise. Elara opened her notebook, quietly continuing to take notes as if it were just another normal day. But the world, for her and for many others, had irrevocably shifted, and she knew this was just the beginning. Elara didn't need external acknowledgement, because the truth had already spoken for itself. She had not only won a competition but also defeated the prejudices that had lingered too long in the academic world. With her unparalleled intelligence, indomitable willpower, and fierce determination, she had forced those who had once looked down on her to fundamentally change their perspective. Ilara's triumph wasn't about seeking applause or validation from the very people who had tried to diminish her. She knew deep down that genuine recognition often isn't freely given, especially by those who feel threatened by your existence. But that no longer mattered. She had chosen a different path, to let the truth speak for itself. She didn't need to argue, to convince anyone of her worth, or to engage in endless debates about fairness. Her genius, expressed through the undeniable language of mathematics, stood as its own irrefutable proof. The complex equations she solved on that board weren't just abstract symbols. They transcended every human construct of limitation, skin color, gender, background, prejudice. They were simply right or wrong, and in that universal language, Ilara was always right. Her victory extended far beyond the confines of a competition. It was a larger battle won, a triumph over the skeptical glances, the dismissive chuckles, and the unwritten rules that sought to define her fate from the moment she walked into that classroom. No one could erase that win. No one could deny that the student they had once looked down upon now stood at the pinnacle of academic achievement. The shift in Dr. Thorne's classroom was palpable, a quiet revolution. Gone were the condescending stares, the mocking smiles, replaced by gazes of curiosity, respectful nods, and hushed words of admiration. A new awareness dawned in the eyes of many students, as if an old, oppressive rule had just been shattered before them. Ilara's victory resonated not just for herself, but for countless others. She had carved a path, making it clear that future generations wouldn't have to start from a disadvantaged position, simply because they didn't fit into a system built to hold them back. She had fundamentally altered perceptions of ability, intelligence, and sheer willpower, silencing those who once thought she would never succeed. And that was a prize far more valuable than any trophy. Ilara continued her studies, quietly taking notes as if life were simply business as usual. Yet, the entire world around her had changed, and she knew this was only the beginning. She had proven her worth not through words, but through an undeniable truth. She had not only won a competition, but had dismantled the deep-seated prejudices that had lingered too long in the academic world. With a potent combination of intellect, indomitable willpower, and fierce determination, she had forced those who once looked down on her to fundamentally shift their perspective. Ilara's story isn't just about one extraordinary individual. It's about a universal struggle, about the invisible barriers that so many still face every single day. Perhaps you've walked into a room where you felt judged before you even spoke. Maybe you've had an idea dismissed or a skill overlooked simply because you didn't fit someone else's preconceived notion of what you should be. Perhaps you've been told you don't belong, that you're not enough, or that your dreams are too big for someone like you. If you were Ilara, if you found yourself judged before the game even began, what would you do? Would you fight or accept stepping back? Would you let others define your limits, or would you dare to write your own equation of worth? Ilara's journey reminds us that our true power lies not in convincing our detractors, but in consistently living our truth. In a world that sometimes tries to diminish us, our actions, our unwavering dedication, and our quiet conviction in our own abilities are the most powerful arguments we possess. Just like Ilara, you don't need a loud voice if your actions speak volumes. You don't need anyone's permission to be brilliant, to be capable, to be you. So, what's your equation of defiance? What invisible barriers are you ready to shatter in your own life? What truth are you ready to let speak for itself? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If Ilara's journey resonated with you, and if you believe in the power of overcoming adversity, Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring more inspiring stories that challenge the status quo.